So floor is open. Colin has a mic, and you can make a comment. You can say something that you thought was really interesting that your partner lifted up, etc. To lift the veil, one of the reasons for doing that, there's a couple. One is to get you to meet somebody you didn't really know before, which I think is good. Two is that often some people who have really great ideas, need to kind of cue it up with someone else first rather than being able to jump in. So it's a way of lifting up the quieter voices in the room. And it gives me a break too, so it's really good. So any comments, questions, ideas?
So George Eisherman, and actually my partner Rochelle and I sort of had a different take on the same issue, I think. And I'll say it my way, which is on one of your slides you talked about ecosystem. And my question is, what really is an ecosystem in the context of organizing? Because our discussion was what has to do with resources, relationships, those kinds of things. How do you translate the quantitative approach that you laid out in terms of the environmental issues and the relationship to populations and the impact, and then you talk about the ecosystem. But what is it? Talk about it some more.
Yeah, so the ecosystem, it's interesting. Traditional view of community organizing, the old Alinsky view really was both interest-based organizing. You organize people on the basis of their self-interest, and you try to create one organization. And I think that that's just not the way to go these days. Number one, you need to organize people on their values, not their interests, because values get people to stick together for a longer time than interests. And you can see that, for example, in the way that the Dreamers kind of captured the national narrative. They have an interest-based argument, which is that why would you waste the talent of these young people, undocumented in the country, grew up here, willing to contribute. But their values are just, we believe in the American dream. They really kind of captured the narrative. But the organizational thing, too, which is kind of interesting, it's something we sort of learned here in Los Angeles, that I think it's emerged often in the rest of the country. So in LA, we've got an economic justice effort, which includes the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, which is a kind of labor-based affiliate. We've got a group in South LA called Scope, which does stuff on regional stuff. We've got the Bus Riders Union, which is working on transit. And it's that sort of overall ecosystem or groups working together that actually transforms the politics and style of an area and not just one group. Our traditional thing has been to kind of invest in one group and think that group's going to move things rather than understanding the ecosystem. And I want to give you a couple of really clear examples of that so that it sort of makes some sense to you. But the easiest one is the following. There's a very powerful group that you're going to hear from later in the day, Community Coalition in South LA. Originally formed a community coalition against substance abuse, and it's got a bunch of other things in its name, and it was really trying to deal with the crack cocaine epidemic. But when it polled the neighborhoods, what it found out was that people were most worried about liquor stores and the fact that people kind of agglomerated around liquor stores and it was a neighborhood hazard, right? So they wound up organizing against liquor stores. Well, Community Coalition has gone on to become an incredibly powerful group working on issues of taking back the community by making parks become more lively with people so gangs won't be there. They've tackled the educational infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. Amazing group, big group. You'll hear from Marquise Harris Dawson, who is, by the way, the president and CEO of Community Coalition. He's also the guy I lift weights with twice a week, right? So good friend. Here's the only thing Community Coalition has ever really asked me to do and insisted that I do it. To go do strategic planning with inner city struggle in East LA. Because they know that their group in South LA will only be able to achieve educational reform if there's a strong, functioning, high-performance group in East LA, and that happens to be inner city struggle that's more nascent, sort of needs more help. So my staff has gone in and helped them with strategic planning, Community Coalition, but I never have, right? But the only thing they've ever asked me to do is to go to East LA. That's an ecosystem approach not an empire building approach, not an organizational approach. When people approach us about work, I think we hope to be part of this too. When people approach us about research work, the first question we ask is, can someone else do it? And I'll give you an example of this. I got called out at a meeting. I was talking about environmental justice and, presenting some of this work in the Bay Area, some of the work in LA, and this woman from Fresno lifts her hand up, Fresno Metro Ministry. She goes, you keep talking about the coast, but what about Fresno? When are you going to come to the Central Valley? I said, okay, I'll come to the Central Valley, but I'm not going to do research with you. But I will tell you how to set up a research university community partnership. So I went and did a session there, and they brought some people down from the University of California, Davis, and something called the Center, what became the Center for Regional Change. And they wound up working together for 3 years. They produced their own report on environmental conditions in the Central Valley. They wound up, that was their first report, so the research team ran it past us, and we helped make it right because there were some things they didn't understand, right? But when the report came out, it was a really solid report. They've been working together for multiple years since, right? And they just got a big grant from the California Wellness Foundation to continue their work with the community and the University of California, Davis. That's an ecosystem approach, not an empire approach, right? Because we gave away work that we could have had. It would have made us bigger, but it would not have made the movement stronger. Does that make sense? And I think that that's an attitude that's increasingly developing amongst community organizers who are asking themselves, who are their partners? How can they strengthen their partners? How do they strengthen their networks? And that's really key.
Okay, great. Hi.
Oh, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Terry Allen from the Cuyahoga County Health Department in Cleveland. Jamel and I were talking, and one of the issues that struck me was your point about the governmental or existing powers that be, the discomfort at some of the approaches. Can you talk a bit about the roles that you've seen sort of effectively in this design around impact with government, academia, nonprofits, sort of the players in the ecosystem, how to best support the work to move towards success? And I know it's complex, and there's, I'm sure, no one easy answer, but I think it's important to understand the different roles. Thank you.
Well, I think I'll speak to the issue that you raised. Well, there's two. First, the issue you raised most directly. I think that with regard to government agencies, that one of the things that we need to be clear about is to be sympathetic to the fact that they often feel berated, right? Like, so their view is that, when they open things up to participation, they often get kabuki. And, like if you run a planning department, the people who initially come to your planning meetings are people who know more about planning than you do and more about the land use and the zoning codes, and you're like, who are you? Like, do you have a life, right? And it just becomes, really irritating. And that's often their experience. What they don't have an experience with is that when you flood the zone, that is when you bring in a lot of people, you get more normal people, right? And when you create opportunities for people to participate through charrettes and through focus groups and through community-based participatory research, they start to moderate their own views, right? And you begin to find ways to come to common consensus. So we've did a little bit of this with the city of Pasadena years ago, and it's interesting. They totally believe in participation right now. With the ARB, with the Air Resources Board, at the beginning, we had a champion who really believed in participation, but a lot of the staff was scared. But what happened was every time they tried to do something without opening the doors to community participation, it got slapped down. And when they realized that once you opened it up and people came in, people would start to accept some of the outcomes, it was a lot better. So I think what organizers do is very interesting. They don't just proselytize and say, here's where I am, you've got to come here. They try to go to you and find out what your story is, what your situation is, what your challenges are. And often with people who work in bureaucracies, we don't go and say, well, what are the challenges? How can I help you? How do we help get more people into the process, et cetera? And so I find that we need to kind of organize those folks. I think that the other thing that might be useful here for some of your connected to academic institutions is that we need to make a big shift in our academic institutions so that we move from publish or perish to public or perish, right? Which is that we need to stop thinking that the merit, the marker of success is an article in an increasingly obscure journal, and understand that it's when we get something out into the public that actually changes the debate in the public square. I mean, how many of you in a graduate program were taught to write an op-ed? Or like even speak to people, right? So we're not training people the right way, we don't reward the people the right way, and the one thing I would say, like I've gotten like a ton of publications, grants, and academic mileage out of environmental justice work. And here's the reason, and a bunch of other work that we've done, and here's the reason why. Like, I don't want it to be wrong, because somebody's using it to make change, and they're going to get nailed if I make a mistake, right? So I think I'm careful in all my academic work, but the stuff I know communities are going to use, it's tighter. It's better, right? Because I'm worried that they're going to get weakened by my mistake. So I'm not going to let that go out wrong. So we need to help people understand that this community engagement is not coincident with or synonymous with a deterioration in quality. It involves an increase in quality and then an attempt to communicate to the public. Other comments, questions?
I'm Kate Hespace. I'm a community organizer with PICO National Network. The first thing I just want to express is deep gratitude. I rarely see our profession, a profession that I deeply believe in, laid out so eloquently and succinctly and with such respect. So thank you very much. So Melissa and I were talking, and it's a two-part, but I think they're connected. You're at Northwestern, and how do I explain organizing to my academic colleagues? How do I begin to get them to understand this? And I said, when I managed a community-led health impact assessment in Minnesota on the largest transit infrastructure, and PolicyLink did the research, but because the questions and the research was designed by the community, it became less than and easier to dismiss because it was community-led. So how do we partner with academia and then create robust research that's not lessened by the fact that it's community-owned and led?
Oh, gosh, such easy questions. I think that, so first, thank you for those very kind words. I mean, it's really humbling to hear them about getting it right, because that's what we're always worried about doing, is making sure that we get it right. One of the things I think is critical is to make sure that there's a lot of rigor in the research you're presenting too, so that it can't be characterized as less than. And I think that that's something we try to be quite good at doing. And there's one other thing we do which I think may be useful. I found it to be very useful on the environmental work, and then also on some other bits of work I can talk to you about. Work we've done with citizenship and immigration services and naturalization rates, stuff we've done with the metro here with regard to local employment, et cetera. And it is, and this is for you, Melissa, from Northwestern, it's what I call nerd-to-nerd relations. So we always make sure that we've got really good relationships with the technical people inside the agencies we might be targeting. Because usually the technical people, they're cool, right? And if you can convince them of the factual merits of an argument, they're there. So I'm going to give you the best example of this, the funnest example. When we did that environmental justice report I was talking about for the Bay Area, when we released it that morning in Richmond at the refinery, it was like at 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. in the morning, and like an hour later, the head of the air quality district there, air quality management district there, BAQMD, came out and said, this report just can't be right, blah, 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 it's crappy, these groups are just being hysterical. he came out 2 hours later because his staff called him and said, we've actually been working with these guys for like, last 2 years. They're the ones who helped us. We took some of their data and showed them how to reshape it to new census shapes, right? And, we worked with it. We provided them stuff. They saw the regressions we had done. And he came back out. He said, there might be something to this study, and we're really going to get down. And I think that was because we had nerd-to-nerd relationships, right? So we didn't really have access to the top guy, but all the technical people were convinced that what we were doing was correct. We've had the same set of things going on with the tool we've developed around the environmental justice screening method, where the technical people are often getting overruled by the political people, but they're like, these guys are right. So I think it's really important that's where ecosystem comes in too, right? Organizing isn't just outside organizing, it's also inside organizing. And that's where I think academics can play a particularly important role.
We had a good discussion, Dr. Magna and I did, regarding sort of daydreaming about what sort of community participation could take place that would shift the power and resources in healthcare utilization, the dollars spent in remedial care at the end of life, the tragic repeated use of imaging and expansive and exploratory testing in the last weeks of life, to preventive care, to strategies that would really equip our population with things that would dramatically reduce costs down the line. One of the things that we wondered about is how do you get people to engage over things that they're, one, not aware of, that there is that shift, and may not be able to come to the table with the sort of information it takes to do that. We struggle with the idea of how exactly would we engage the community in demanding things that they don't know exist or that they don't know were really lost at the table when people were spending their health dollars.
Well, you're going to have some of the best organizers locally and elsewhere in today to answer some of those questions, and you've got, PICO national here. So the one thing I would say that's structurally difficult about what you're lifting up is that those issues affect people at different times. So when you're facing an environmental justice issue, it's affecting everybody in the community at the same time. When you're looking at the over-incarceration of youth and the way in which that's creating problems in a community, it seems to be affecting everybody at the same. So people might be more affected acutely by a family member at a particular time, but the over-incarceration is affecting the entire community. When you're looking at unemployment, it's kind of all happening at the same time. The difficult thing, I think, and this actually, because, when you first asked your question, what I'm thinking about is I have a mother-in-law who's in the last couple of months, and my God, the way the medical system is trying to prolong the agony instead of letting her die with dignity. And I'm so glad my parents went quickly and with great dignity and integrity. And I don't know what, the way that we need to do work to educate people about the end of life and what it means to not be terrified by it, but to think about what that passage looks like in dignity, I think that's a really critical thing. You might be able to build there with people who've gone through it, because it's something we're all going to go through ourselves or be touched by in our lives with others, right? And I think getting people to think through that is a very, very difficult, it's not the right time, right, when it's going on, right? Because that's when people who haven't thought about it get a little desperate and throw every resource that they don't have but the system has at it, and it winds up not being good for the person who's surviving and not being good for the system as a whole. So, I think thinking about what a long-term strategy is to get people to think about that question of how do you want to live and how do you want to die, and opening up that conversation. Let me say that I think that one really good place to do it is through faith-based institutions. And that's something that those of us who might be more on the academic or science side of things may find it somewhat hard to do. It's certainly what PICO's been pretty expert at doing. And the way that I try to think about it, I'm not a religious person, but I've made sure that we've got an evangelical Christian on our staff, because she's a progressive evangelical, but somehow it gives me a little bit more understanding to be around somebody who really deeply believes in God and has that inform a big part of their decision making. And it's helped me realize that if you're in this room and you're worried and concerned about issues of justice and equity and dignity for people, it's not just because you took a class in college and it deeply affected you. It's because you feel something emotional and spiritual and human, and you want to have that be honored in the world. You don't think it's good to be in a world in which people don't get a chance to realize their potential, in which people are disconnected from one another, and in which they're unhealthy as a result. And if you can tap into that spiritual and moral element that actually drives you to do this work, then the connection you can make with others is so much bigger. Now, you might make it around faith, but you might make it around other things, because the fundamental question there, it's kind of about cost saving, and that would be good, because then we could put more money into things that are better for health, right? But man, you know, it's about, will you die with dignity? It's, will you live with health? Will you avoid drugs and alcohol, not just because it's sort of, you know, bad morally, but because it's bad for how you're going to feel emotionally, and it doesn't let you really be in touch with yourself. We don't own that deep side of ourselves enough for bringing it to the conversation. It's all about rationality. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Kathy Bazzi from Dow Chemical. And the dialogue that Thomas and I had was around some common questions that both of us thought about during your session, and I'd like to add my own personal thanks for the work that you're doing and the leadership you've provided. But our question was, this seems to be profoundly valuable, and we applaud it, and that was, how do you bring this to scale, that your work is touching some number of communities? There are similar sorts of pockets of things happening around the country, but there are lots of areas where it's not happening. And we're really intrigued by what is it that it's going to take to enable this kind of work at scale.
Well, what's interesting is it's starting to occur more at scale in this state. And so we've got, you know, the last year, California decided to raise its minimum wage to $10 an hour. We passed a domestic workers' bill of rights. We granted driver's licenses to undocumented drivers. We did a pretty good job with California Covers, which was the Obamacare rollout. We passed the law that I mentioned, that says that 25% of the revenues from cap and trade need to go to less advantaged communities. So one of the things I think that's happening is that people are jumping up to scale, but it's taken quite a few years to do it here. And I think getting to scale involves people being bold enough to think about power statewide and where you can change things. Oh, the other thing we did in the state was we passed taxes for the first time since Prop 13. We passed something called Prop 30, which has brought $6 to $9 billion into the state coffers, basically eliminated our deficit. And that was actually driven, interestingly, by a bunch of community groups under a banner called California Calls. They were really a key factor in making that happen. And they had a really interesting model of scale where they began to try to mobilize new and occasional voters by targeting people in a bunch of different areas, including areas people would not normally target. This is just so worth talking about in terms of going to scale. So here's a couple things that they did. They always had a strong base in sort of South LA and East LA, but those are voters you can count on. They really wanted to mobilize voters, say, in the Inland Empire, Riverside, San Bernardino. And by the way, you don't mobilize them with leftist rhetoric, right? You don't show up with a Che Guevara t-shirt, right? So they had to convince all their organizers to buy polo shirts, right? And to just walk into the neighborhood and ask people, what are your dreams for California? What would you like to see California become? And sort of begin to not move to the middle, but move the middle by tapping into their values. So I think there's a lot of people who are doing some really interesting scaling experiments. I think that community organizers have figured out that you need to scale from neighborhood to region and then to state. And that by fortifying that, you may be able to scale to nation. I think one of the things that happen at a national level is we don't really have a national movement for justice, and as a result, it's pretty easy to lose battles in Washington. What I think we haven't scaled is the academic side of things, the research side of things, the complementary part of that ecosystem. We haven't because, academics are actually pretty, what's the right word for it? Fundamentally lonely, That is, they're so used to kind of working on their own or claiming credit. We actually, for the last couple of years, been trying to bring together kind of what we call progressive community-engaged research institutions in California. And, everybody had this goal. We're going to get together. We're going to be like one big ecosystem. My goal, which took us 2 years to achieve, was that when anybody put out a report, everybody else would publicize it. Right? Which just seems obvious, right? That's building the ecosystem. That took 2 years, right? So that send me your report and let me know what day you're putting it out. I'm not going to scoop you, but that afternoon, we're going to hit social media and pump your report. And it took us, by the way, a year of demonstrating that we were doing that to other people before people started to do it for us, right? But for a year, we just did it for other people. Then they started doing it for us. And all of a sudden, all this stuff is being amplified. So we need to break a lot of bad habits that we've got in the Academy about doing work individually, about not connecting together, about thinking that it's a shrunken pool rather than a world that we need to change so desperately that the idea that you would not collaborate is saying that you're going to leave change to chance rather than to strategy. So maybe one more question?
I'll take that.
Okay.
Manuel, I just want to, like Kate, just gracias, thank you. I feel like in 15 minutes you validated my work, my passion, my life, so thank you. My question, well, there's two parts to it. You used the word dignified about 16 times in the last 30 minutes, and I really appreciate that. The work of changing policy, both with a big P and a little p, is really hard, intensive work with a lot of failures. And I partially know the answer to this question just because of my own experience. Yesterday we went to inner city struggles and we heard this, that in order to make a movement happen, you have to also take care of the immediate need, right? These kids are showing up because they can get help with homework and they can get help going into college, and they're also part of a larger movement. My question to you is, I really want to hear your thoughts on this, is how do you keep the morale lifted when it's so difficult to change policies, and both, again, at the organizational, institutional, and at the political level? And then my second question relates somewhat to scale. And I noticed you didn't mention social media, and I feel like I'm stuck between a generation that's what's it about, and one that's still trying to figure out how to make it relevant. Yeah, how do you use social media to scale some of these ideas and the movement moving forward?
Great. Well, you'll notice the Twitter handle, so please follow.
I don't have a Twitter account, I'll confess.
So, one of the things and by the Twitter's a fascinating kind of instrument to start to use and understand what the kind of culture is about it. But let me do the social media stuff, and then on the social media stuff, I think that one of the things we need to do is to move from thinking about social media, high tech and high touch as being two different things, right? That it's either traditional organizing or this kind of thin online organizing. You need to do both, right? So I think one of the things to do is to make sure that our attitudes are about, do we have all the pieces going in place? And one of the things I have found about social media use at my staff, we've got a communications coordinator. We're, probably the one of the few research shops at a university where half the people have been organizers. And we have got a full-time communications coordinator who's really tried to make sure we've got a good social media presence, because it really does move things, and you really can drive things but ultimately you have to be able to mobilize people too. So on the optimism, that's also something, it's kind of interesting. When we bring grad students in, we tell them that there's 2 or 3 bad habits they're going to have to get rid of. First bad habit is that doing all your work alone. We had a student who was an intern for us for 2 years, great student, she's now a permanent employee, And she was an intern. She was from UCLA, which shows you, by the way, what peacemakers we are, USC, UCLA. She was an intern for us for 2 years, and at the end of the 2 years, the professors asked her, okay, in order to evaluate your internship, can you show us a piece of work that you've done alone? And she said, no, I've never done anything alone in that shop. Everything in that shop has been in collaboration with other people. Second bad habit, then I'll get to the last part, that grad students bring is the idea of using multisyllabic words as a way of demonstrating their intelligence. And our thing is, can you say it simply so we can understand it and therefore anybody? And the third thing they bring is another thing grad students school puts into you, pessimism, right? Nothing can change. That's not exactly what you're talking about, but one of our brands is that we're permanently optimistic. We actually do think things can change. Now, I think there are setbacks, but you really need to think about the fact that in the last couple of years, a ragtag group of kids who have no right to be in the country launched a dream movement and managed to force a president to change his policy to have them stay in the country. And they put comprehensive immigration reform squarely on the agenda, where it went to the House of Representatives, where all good ideas go to die. But it's still on the agenda. They changed the national narrative, where gay and lesbian brothers and sisters put the issue of marriage equality by putting their stories forward about their lives, and they've permanently changed the way that we think about things, where workers, by telling their stories of difficulties economically, have raised the issues of inequality and put the increase in the minimum wage squarely on the agenda. Where in Los Angeles, kids from South LA and East LA, and they might have talked about this, ran a campaign to make sure that college-ready courses would be in every school in Los Angeles. They did that. They won that. And I don't know whether they showed you the video, but watching these kids walk out going, we just won, right? They were like, we just spoke up and we won. And to me, there are setbacks, but they are the gasps of a dying order. And there is a new world waiting to be born. And it will not be born if we don't make sure that our party, and I don't mean political party, but the party we're saying we want you to come to, if it's not fun, right? It's got to be fun. It's got to be winning. It's got to be positive. It's got to be something you want to be in and be with. And that, I think, is something I learned from organizers, too. Whatever happens, you won. And you transform it into a win so that people feel empowered to be able to go forward the next day. Will there be setbacks? Are there times when you lose things? Yes. But, we are really, I think, moving from some really difficult days to some brighter days ahead. It's not automatic that's going to happen. It's going to take a lot more organizing, a lot more research, etc. But I remain the son of immigrants, quite positive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manuel. That was both profound and inspiring, and we're so grateful for you spending your time with us this morning. I'd like to ask our first panel speakers to come up and have a seat. The moderator will be George Flores, who's the program manager at the California Endowment and a member of the Roundtable and a member of our planning committee.